In Chicago's cultural and social zeal of the 1920s, the construction of Soldier Field Stadium emerged as a tangible symbol of the rapidly changing city, reflecting the vibrant energy and rampant growth of those years. Situated on the picturesque shores of Lake Michigan, Soldier Field is emblematic of Chicago's rich history and vibrant cultural landscape. However, in recent years, when the city added a bizarre-looking addition atop the historic structure, it became the focal point of a controversial debate, with the most passionate opponents spreading notions of discontent and even accusations of dishonor. So I guess the question is, was Chicago's Soldier Field disgraced? Join me to find out, as today we discover the history of Soldier Field and its evolution between preservation and progress. I'm your host, Ryan Sokash, and you're watching It's History. After the Great Fire of 1871, Chicago underwent significant rebuilding over several decades. Between 1906 and 1909, the Chicago Industrialist Committee, financing work and construction in the town, had begun to consider building in the lakefront area, where there was an ample green space called Lake Park. In fact, Daniel Burnham and Edward H. Bennett's 1909 plan for Chicago specifically designated this lakefront area for sports activities. Before construction, the land was most likely part of a natural prairie or marshes. From the onset, this project was fraught with controversy, with several citizens forming committees to protest the decision to build in the park. You see, like many other American cities, Chicago was highly polluted, and its rapid industrial growth contributed to the deterioration of living conditions. So, for several years, legal battles blocked the realization of Burnham's project, but these were overcome by political will. For example, during the First World War, in July of 1918, 5 months before the war's end, a committee was formed to campaign for a temporary memorial, followed by a permanent one at the war's end. Several projects were presented, but the most striking was a memorial with a colonnade topped by a 500-foot tower with a statue. The commission explicitly stated that all projects could be interesting, but that the aim was not only to create the conditions for celebration, but also to help soldiers returning home after experiencing the horrors of war. A project was quickly agreed upon for the sports facility that would contribute to these soldiers' health and enjoyment, and that of the general population. Around this time, there was a small temporary stadium on the site of the future Soldier Field, which hosted several competitions between 1907 and 1913. In 1919, the plans for the memorial and the stadium were merged, and the competition for the project was reopened. In the end, Halliburton and Root won the architectural competition to build the stadium. The architect's design proved successful because they decided that the primary requirement was not that the stadium could be used for popular sports or even for the pageants, military parades, and political demonstrations. Rather, the most important consideration, they believed, was aesthetic. The architects wrote, quote, "The Field Museum is considered the head of the composition, the access of the stadium being the same as that of the museum. This attempt to conform to the Field Museum partly explains why the stadium was only 300 feet wide. Still, the architects' justification for keeping the stadium so narrow was what they considered to be the second essential requirement. By concentrating the seating around the central part of the field, they attempted to, quote, give the most significant number of people the best views of those athletic games and similar events." Halliburton and Root had good reason for making the stadium compatible with the Field Museum. Letters between the competing architects, as a team and as a group, and Perkins, the head of the Park Commission, made it clear that whatever they did, the architects were not to overwhelm the Field Museum. The two adhered closely to these restrictions, with two exceptions. They considered the idea that the stadium should be a tribute to fallen soldiers, that it should be a massive memorial that would be an impressive addition to the skyline. They also slightly broke the height restrictions by raising the central stands to 60 feet, allowing for more seating around the pitch than rival designs. The proposed monument looked like a cross between the Washington and Lincoln monuments. It would have risen above the central stands of the stadium, with columns at the same level as the colonnade of the present stadium. and many suspect that this design was modeled on the ancient mausoleum at Halicarnassus, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, and would have equaled or surpassed the entire facade of the Field Museum. And that was just the base. The Temple of the Soldiers would have been an obelisk 4 times as tall as the top of the arcade. To design the colonnades, Holabird and Root worked with a designer who had recently worked on the Lincoln Memorial, another structure with Doric columns. The original configuration was U-shaped, with the structure's opening facing the Field Museum. This allowed for easy access to the field, as well as a direct view on the nearby Field Museum for spectators. Originally not intended to be a football stadium, the idea was to create a space to host various events, including athletic competitions, military exercises, exhibitions, and community gatherings, while also serving as a place of remembrance. The design was inspired by classical architecture, with a colonnade facade of Doric columns surrounding the stadium. The stadium was built by the South Park Commission, which later merged with other commissions to form the Chicago Park District in 1934. And I have to wonder if those involved in the process had any idea that Soldier Field would become a monument to the era, a flagship venue for the golden age of sports, and today, one of few such stadiums still standing. Anyhow, the stadium was built in 3 phases between 1922 and 1939 at $13 million. It was officially opened on the 9th of October 1924, coinciding with the 53rd anniversary of the fire that destroyed the city's Municipal Grant Park Stadium. The name was changed to Soldier Field on the 11th of November, 1925, in memory of the U.S. soldiers who died in war. The neoclassical design pays homage to the ancient Roman Colosseum, a facility of strength, endurance, and a sense of grandeur. The people of Chicago had many reservations about the ongoing construction. Despite political pressure to build in the area, there were still immense fears that new buildings would further spoil the environment. And the fact that this new building was right up on the lake, the city's water supply, made it a key topic of environmental concern. Anyhow, once completed, the project demonstrated the architect's ability to reconcile the various demands. Large green spaces and a vast park had been created around the stadium. Chicagoans quickly embraced the new structure as a central place to celebrate the city's achievements and honor its heroes. The stadium's construction had an essential impact on sports in the city, as the new facility allowed for the practice of many competitive Olympic-style events. And the documentation of heritage here is quite amazing. For example, the park in front of the stadium contains several monuments, most built in recent decades. However, one extraordinary and technically ancient memorial dates back to the 1930s. I'm talking about the mostly forgotten Balbo Monument. And you might be asking yourself, if it's from the 1930s, how is it ancient? Well, let me explain. An essential element of the memorial is a compressed stone column known as breccia, from a Roman structure on the shores of Ostia, Italy, dating back to the time of Julius Caesar. A gift from Mussolini, the monument was inaugurated on Italy Day in 1934 during Chicago's second edition of the World's Fair, a century of progress. Mussolini donated the column to the city to commemorate the flight of the Italian amphibious plane that landed in Chicago in 1933 during the first year of the fair. This transatlantic flight, the first of its kind by the Italian Air Force, was so technically demanding that the seaplane crew had trained together for over a year before the trip. The Corinthian column was carefully dismantled, loaded onto 24 seaplanes, transported, and re-erected near the Italian pavilion, an airplane-shaped building commemorating the feat of General Balbo and his squadron. The Italian pavilion was only temporary, but the monument has always remained in the exact location near the harbor in Burnham Park. Other interesting monuments include the Chicago Bears statue of the famous player Walter Payton and the team's founder and first coach George Papa Bear Halas, who for years has also been honored by the initials GSH on the Bears' official jersey. Anyhow, both Browns statues are located at the stadium's southern entrance and were installed in 2019. In 2018, the Chicago Park District commemorated the Flame of Hope, which erected the 30-foot-tall steel sculpture entitled Eternal Flame of Hope in honor of the 50th anniversary of of the Special Olympics. The sculpture by Richard Hunt stands in the plaza next to Soldier Field, where the first games were held 50 years ago in 1968. The eternal flame of hope symbolizes the Special Olympics theme of inclusion, unity, and hope. The sculpture weighs approximately 7,000 pounds and has a continuous flame that can grow up to 15 feet. East of Soldier Field is the Gold Star Families Memorial, dedicated in 2006, which honors all police officers who have died or been injured in the line of duty since the founding of the Chicago Police Department in the late 1830s. Another important monument is the Tribute to Freedom and Water Wall, created in 2003. The bronze monument depicts servicemen and women and their families relaxing on Chicago's lakefront with the skyline in the background. The figures represent Chicagoans from a wide range of historical periods. This 50-foot sculpture is located at the north entrance to Soldier Field. When completed, Soldier Field contained 74,280 permanent seats and pine bleachers, and then an additional 30,000 temporary seats could be placed inside of the field itself, on the upper concourse, as well as the large open terrace beyond the north end zone. The first event held at Soldier Field was a 1,000-man police match, which reportedly drew a crowd of 90,000. Then, the stadium's first football game occurred when Notre Dame played Northwestern in November of 1924, with Notre Dame winning 12-6. Among the first competitions held at the stadium were two in the spring of 1925. This event was an interscholastic track and field meet sponsored by Loyola University. Then there were the first annual Chicago Olympics, sponsored by the Finnish American Athletic Association. The Loyola event featured one of the most famous athletes of the 1920s, the flying man, Paavo Nurmi, who had won 5 Olympic gold medals for Finland in the previous year. But the stadium also hosted several other amateur sports. There were 5-a-side football and running events. It hosted the first boxing event with a gate of over 2.5 million, the first skiing match held in a stadium, and then, for the time at least, there was the most significant football crowd gathering ever, at 123,000 people in attendance. But still, at this point in the story, football had not taken center stage in Chicago. In fact, the first professional sport to be staged at Soldier Field is one more associated with Texas than Chicago: rodeo. You see, during the heyday of the city's meatpacking industry, many Chicagoans, including Richard J. Daley before he entered politics, worked as cowboys, rounding up cattle at the Union stockyards. Many men and women who attended the first rodeos at Soldier Field were ranch hands rather than professionals on the rodeo circuit. However, the sport changed dramatically as Soldier Field became popular during the 2 world wars. And this is when the popularity of official rodeo skyrocketed, Wild West shows more or less disappeared, and the first professional rodeo organizations were formed. Rodeo stars became professionals, and in the years when Soldier Field rodeos were most popular, similar shows in New York attracted up to 250,000 people. But to be fair, Soldier had been known, at least with a cult following, as a football stadium, since about 1926, when there were Army-Navy games. But this would also be the year that Soldier Field would officially host its first professional league, when on Armistice Day, a match took place between the Chicago Bears and the Chicago Cardinals, and this was something of a special event, as the Bears would not officially move into the stadium until 1971. Anyhow, this event was for charity to help raise funds for the construction of Rosary College in River Forest. The Cardinals have occasionally played at the stadium since 1926, whereas the Bears and other professional teams have played the annual college all-star games there since 1934. And it might surprise you to find out that the first professional football team to call Soldier Field home was the Chicago Rockets, as a part of the all-new American Football Conference formed in 1946. The Rockets played 4 seasons at Soldier Field before changing their name to the Hornets for the 1949 season. However, the name changes in 1949 did not prevent the team from having another lousy season. In fact, the Hornets finished with a loss to the Cleveland Browns and a record of just 4 wins with 8 losses. The conference did not fare much better, and on the 9th of December, 1949, conference officials reached an agreement that allowed the most popular teams, Baltimore, Cleveland, and San Francisco, to join the NFL. There was talk of a Houston businessman buying the Hornets franchise for a short time, but the news soon faded. The Chicago Cardinals used it as their home field for their final season in Chicago in 1959. The Chicago Cardinals was the franchise's original name. And it's funny to think that most of us might not realize that, as these days they're known as the Arizona Cardinals. A decade later, in September of 1971, the Chicago Bears moved in, initially with a 3-year commitment. The Chicago Bears, one of America's most essential and oldest franchises, were founded in 1919 in Decatur, Illinois. The team moved to Chicago in 1921 and played at Wrigley Field Stadium until 1970. However, they were forced to move to a larger venue due to post-merger regulations between the AFL and the NFL, which required stadiums to hold more than 50,000 spectators. And so it was. On September the 19th, 1971, the Bears played their first home game at Soldier Field, defeating the Pittsburgh Steelers 17-15. In 1978, the Bears and the Chicago Park District agreed to a 20-year lease and renovation of the stadium. Both parties pooled their resources for the renovation. In 1971, the stadium underwent a significant preseason remodeling, including new lighting, playing surface, and locker rooms, redesigned seating now with backs and armrests, and improved sightlines. Although nationally known as the home of the Bears, Chicago's Soldier Field has a storied history as a municipal venue and the site of countless sporting, civic, and even religious events. In 1968, Soldier Field hosted the first Special Olympics, an international event for children and adults with disabilities. There was also that time back in 1944 when up to 150,000 spectators attended a wartime visit by President Franklin Roosevelt, making it one of the most crowded political events in modern history. There were also religious events, such as the International Meeting of Protestant and the Orthodox Christian denominations, as well as the celebration of the Catholic Marian Year, both of which are cited as the largest events held at the stadium in 1954. These events were made possible thanks to the presence of an impressive convention hall inside of the columned part of the building. But not to get too off topic, of course, the reoccurring events are related to football matches, and they are celebrated to this very day. In fact, those attending games often arrive a little early so that they can have fun at tailgate parties before each game. These parties are held for free on the north side of the stadium. The party is open to the public and features food, music, activities, and sometimes performances by a drumline. However, change was on the horizon, and the tailgaters would soon experience a drastic transformation in the scenery in the years to come. Considering its history, Soldier Field received several awards for its importance to American heritage, as well as its architectural magnificence. Accordingly, it was listed on the National Register of Historic Places in 1984 and designated a National Historic Landmark in 1987. This was done not only in honor of its architecture, but also for its historical significance in major events of the 20th century. And hence, in 2001, the Chicago Park District, which owns the facility, faced considerable criticism when it announced plans to rebuild the stadium using a very radical design. And to be fair to Chicago, there was probably no easy way around this one, since the aging structure did not meet modern standards, and the amenities offered were less than ideal. Now, I have to warn you, this next part is going to get pretty gross. In short, the sanitary situation was downright nasty, a notion perhaps best captured by the Chicago Tribune in 2002, recalling, quote, "It was halftime of the Bears home game against Jacksonville on January the 6th, when sanitation anarchy broke out. Inside the crowded men's room, near Gate 9, drunken fans who apparently couldn't wait for an open urinal relieved themselves in the sinks. Outside the restrooms, next to the bathroom, lines stretched for more than 30 yards. More desperate fans drained their bladders into empty beer cups behind the backs of watchful buddies. The situation around the stadium's 40 portable toilets wasn't much better. Impatient, increasingly irritable crowds rocked the green plastic outhouses when someone inside was taking too long. As far as football stadiums go, Soldier Field is the worst. From here, the article goes on to explain what the stadium upgrade would achieve. Reading, quote, Under the redesign, the new stadium will have 326 urinals and 114 toilets, a vast improvement from its current 193 urinals, 32 feet of urinal troughs, and 83 toilets. New ladies' rooms will upgrade to 461 toilets, nearly double their current number. Now, I don't know about the rest of you, and I don't know what the situation was like in the ladies' room, but I remember those horrific, vile trough urinals from the perspective of a little kid, and it's one of those memories that I'd much rather forget. So suffice it to say that Chicago had some practical reason for change, and this is just the tip of the iceberg. The poor seating arrangement meant that some seating selections actually had obstructed views. The stadium was not easily accessible for people with disabilities, and there were limited concession options. This is why the stadium's interior would be demolished almost entirely and rebuilt, while the exterior would be preserved as an example of what once was. So on the 19th of January, 2002, the night the Bears lost the playoff to the Philadelphia Eagles, demolition began, and it began in the presence of an ongoing tailgating party. Somewhat astonishingly, the crew managed to remove 24,000 stadium seats in just 36 hours, a speed record never since broken, and this was just the first step towards constructing the new version of Soldier Field. Soldier Field completed a 20-month renovation that upgraded the stadium and the surrounding grounds for multi-use events. The stadium now hosts more than 200 days of events per year, but the result is what took most Chicagoans by surprise. And I remember my first impression of this well. It looked as if a gigantic UFO had just crashed on the old historic building. This new structure obscured the distinctive architectural features of the original stadium. At the west end, cantilevered seating extends and dwarfs the colonnades, blocking the view of the arcades from all angles. The outer skin of the new pool is a curvilinear steel and glass envelope. As the Doric colonnades were the most prominent architectural element of the stadium before the renovation, the addition of the cantilevered pool during the renovation compromised the view of the arcades and the historical appearance. As a result, on the 23rd of September 2004, a 10-member federal advisory committee unanimously recommended that Soldier Field be removed from the National Register of Historic Places. The recommendation for removal was prepared by Carol Algren, an architectural historian at the National Park Service's Midwest Regional Office in Omaha, Nebraska, who, as reported by Preservation Online, said, quote, "If we had to let it go, I think we would have lowered the standard of national historic landmarks across the country. If we want to maintain the integrity of the program, let alone the monuments, we had no choice." All the same, the stadium lost its landmark status on the 17th of February, 2006. Many critics argued that the redesign compromised the historic integrity of Soldier Field. And although I agree with this assessment, I'd also point out that preservationists often go out of their way to intentionally make modern additions look drastically different than any historical part of the structure. This way, generations later, people will be able to easily discern artifacts with replications. For example, when Warsaw's Royal Castle was rebuilt back in the 1970s, they made any non-original trim a bright and tacky-looking artificial gold. This distinction separates fact from fiction. Even so, some citizens expressed dissatisfaction with the redesigned stadium's visual appearance. The juxtaposition of the original classical columns with the modern additions, including the new seating bowl and exterior structure, was perceived by some as architecturally jarring. And perhaps the only thing more jarring than the way it looked was the price tag, a result that the taxpayers paid dearly for. We're talking hundreds of millions of dollars, leading critics to question whether the significant investment in the stadium was justified, especially given other pressing financial priorities for the city. But it's not all bad. Despite this, the stadium is still considered to be one of the most important buildings in the city of Chicago. Moreover, in May of 2012, Soldier Field became the first NFL stadium to achieve LEED status, a program that recognizes environmentally sustainable buildings. I'd also point out that over the years, some of the highly negative reviews of its architecture have been reconsidered. And these days, it's accepted as an essential model for contemporary architecture and the ability to integrate the past with the present. The The stadium remains an icon for the city and beyond. In fact, the first commercial promoting cell phones was produced in Chicago's Soldier Field car park. You might even say that despite architectural changes that have significantly altered the original structure, the home of the Chicago Bears still retains the charm of an iconic 19th century American building. You just have to ignore the newer and, dare I say, hideous-looking upper half. Anyway, that's just my opinion, and I'm totally biased on this one, as my own father took me to countless games and tailgating parties there when I was a kid, which is perhaps why I prefer the original stadium. Am I wrong? I'd love to hear your thoughts, stories, and memories in the comments section below. Also, if there are any experts out there on the topic, get in touch so that we can continue this conversation on our members-only show, The Archive. Otherwise, I thank you for watching, and until next time, this is Ryan Socash, signing off.